These days, it feels like science is catching up with our wildest dreams. Projects to bring back extinct animals aren't just theories anymore. They're happening. Woolly mammoths might be roaming the Arctic again in the next few years. Scientists are working hard to revive the thylacine, the famous Tasmanian tiger. Even the dodo, that odd bird from Mauritius, has a shot at a second life. And just recently, researchers managed to create pups with traits inspired by the mighty dire wolves. Not true dire wolves, but genetically edited wolves carried by domestic dogs as surrogate mothers. It's exciting. It's a little surreal. But there's one Ice Age all-star that's noticeably missing from this de-extinction party. Smilodon, the legendary saber-toothed cat. Yeah, the one often called the saber-toothed tiger, even though it wasn't technically a tiger. A lot of people can't help but wonder, why aren't scientists trying to bring back the saber-toothed cat? I mean, come on, who wouldn't want to see a real-life Smilodon prowling around? It was an apex predator, a total rock star of its time. We're working on dire wolves and mammoths and all that, so why not the saber-toothed cat? First off, DNA, the blueprint of life. If you want to bring an extinct animal back, you need some of its DNA. No DNA, no way to clone it, or even to genetically engineer a proxy. The reason we're even able to consider species like the woolly mammoth or the thylacine is that we have retrievable DNA from them. Woolly mammoths, for example, have been found frozen in Siberian permafrost, literally locked in ice for thousands of years. In those icy conditions, a lot of their tissue, fur, skin, maybe even blood are preserved. Scientists have sequenced the woolly mammoth genome from bits of these remains, so we have a pretty complete genetic blueprint of mammoths to work with. The Tasmanian tiger went extinct more recently in the 1930s, and there are preserved pelts and even baby thylacines kept in jars of alcohol in museums, from which researchers have gotten DNA. The dodo went extinct around the 17th century, and we have some well-preserved bones and maybe tissue from museum specimens or mummified remains on Mauritius that yielded usable DNA for sequencing its genome. Even the dire wolf. There was a big study where scientists extracted DNA from ancient dire wolf bones, like ones preserved in permafrost or dry caves, and managed to sequence a bunch of their genome. So for these creatures, we at least have their genetic code, or most of it, written out. It's step one of any de-extinction attempt. Now, Smilodon. This is where we hit the first brick wall. Smilodon died out about 10,000 years ago. And where do we find most Smilodon fossils? In places like the La Brea tar pits in California or other fossil-rich sites in the Americas. The tar pits are amazing. They trapped loads of animals and preserved their bones beautifully. We have hundreds of Smilodon skeletons from La Brea alone, which is how we know so much about its anatomy. But tar is not a friendly place for DNA. DNA is an organic molecule, and over thousands of years, especially in a warm environment like tar or soil in temperate climates, it breaks down. Unlike mammoths, Smilodon wasn't preserved in ice, at least none that we've found so far. Instead, we get bones that sat in tar or dirt for millennia. That means by now, the genetic material is basically dust. Scientists have tried to find DNA in some saber-toothed cat fossils. I remember reading that a few projects managed to recover tiny fragments of DNA from Smilodon or its relatives, but these are like little snippets, not anywhere close to a full genome. All right, but let's imagine that we somehow did have most of the Smilodon genome, or could infer it. Why not just take a modern big cat and edit its DNA to match? That leads us to the next major issue: genetic distance. Smilodon might look like a big cat, and it is in the cat family, but it's not like the tiger or lion that we know today. Smilodon and other saber-toothed cats split off on the cat family tree a long time ago. How long? Try around 20 million years of separation from any living cat species. That's an eternity in evolution terms. For comparison, lineages of mammoths and modern elephants split maybe 5 or 6 million years ago, and the thylacine is even closer to some living marsupials, since it only went extinct recently. But Smilodon is this weird distant cousin of today's lions, tigers, and house cats that branched off way back in the Miocene epoch and did its own thing. There are no saber-toothed cats left. That whole subfamily is gone, so the closest living relatives we have are Pantherinae, lions, tigers, jaguars, or maybe slightly smaller cats. Even the clouded leopard, which might superficially remind you of a saber-toothed build, is genetically far apart. Why does this matter? because all the de-extinction projects rely on having a close living relative as a sort of genetic template or surrogate. The idea for a mammoth is basically to start with an Asian elephant, which shares about 99% of its DNA with a woolly mammoth, and then edit that 1% of differences to turn it into a mammoth-like creature. With the thylacine, they're looking at one of its closest relatives, a dasyurid marsupial called a fat-tailed dunnart. The dunnart is a lot smaller and a very distant cousin of the thylacine, but genetically, it's one of the nearer options, and they hope to modify dunnart cells step by step to eventually approximate a thylacine genome. The dodo's closest living relative is the Nicobar pigeon, so scientists might try to use pigeon DNA/eggs as the starting point and tweak them until we get something dodo-esque. In each case, there's at least a playbook. Find a close living species and alter it. For Smilodon, there is no close substitute species to start with. The gap between a saber-toothed cat and a lion is enormous. You can't just take a lion genome and flip a few switches to get a saber-tooth. You'd have to flip thousands of switches. In fact, you'd basically have to rewrite the lion's entire genetic code to match what we think Smilodon's code was. We're nowhere near capable of that level of genetic engineering. It's not like editing a few genes for cold resistance or thicker fur. It's redesigning an animal from the ground up. Right now, CRISPR and gene editing technology are amazing, but making a few dozen edits is about the limit of what's been done in big organisms. Making potentially tens of thousands of edits without making a mistake, that's science fiction for the foreseeable future. The more distant the extinct animal is from any living one, the harder it gets exponentially. This brings up another practical challenge. Who's going to be the mom? Cloning and de-extinction isn't just about DNA. It's about growing an embryo and carrying it to term. For something like a Smilodon, you would presumably need a surrogate mother from a living species, a big cat that could handle giving birth to a saber-toothed kitten, maybe a lioness or a tigress. They're the closest in size and anatomy we've got. But even if you could fertilize a lion's egg with some pseudo-Smilodon DNA, there's no guarantee the embryo would develop correctly. The lion's body has evolved to nurture lion embryos, not something from a completely different branch of the family. The pregnancy could fail at any number of stages if the hormones, placenta, or developmental timing are incompatible. It could be a long series of miscarriages or non-viable embryos, which would be heartbreaking and a nightmare from an animal welfare perspective. Think about it. Would it be fair to subject a living lion or tiger to an experimental pregnancy with a genetically Frankensteined embryo? There's a real ethical issue there. Even with elephants and mammoths, some propose trying to avoid using a living elephant as a surrogate by creating an artificial womb. That tech isn't here yet for a mammoth, let alone something like a Smilodon, which would require presumably a big cat surrogate. And even if a lioness could carry a Smilodon cub to term, we have no idea what complications might arise. Smilodon babies might have been larger, or maybe their gestation length was different. We simply don't have data on that. It would be a shot in the dark biologically. Now, let's say by some miracle we bypass both of these giant hurdles. We somehow get a viable Smilodon embryo and a healthy surrogate to birth it. Boom, a saber-toothed kitten is born. What then? Do we just high-five and say, "Welcome back to the world, kitty," and release it into Los Angeles? That would be a disaster, to put it mildly. The modern world is completely different from the world Smilodon used to roam. North America, 10,000 years ago, was full of huge herbivores: mammoths, mastodons, giant ground sloths, giant bison, camels, horses, and even woolly rhinos in some places during colder times. South America had its suit of giant creatures like giant sloths, glyptodons, and herds of large camelids and such. Smilodon was built to hunt those hefty animals. Its whole anatomy, powerful forelimbs, a strong neck, those massive saber teeth, was likely optimized for taking down big, thick-skinned prey, and maybe finishing them off with a precise bite. Now fast forward to today. Those prey species are gone. Who would our resurrected Smilodon hunt? The closest living thing in North America might be bison, which still exists, thankfully, or moose, or maybe elk. Those are big, but not as abundant everywhere, and mostly live in managed herds or protected parks. South America today has like capybaras and deer, nothing like a mammoth for a mega cat to tackle. In desperation, a hungry Smilodon might go after cattle on ranches or even people. That obviously would be a huge problem. You can't just have a giant predator on the loose in a world full of unsuspecting humans and no proper ecological niche. Even if we tried to put it in a controlled setting, say a huge fenced reserve, we'd have to reconstruct an ecosystem for it. You can't have a lone Smilodon sitting in a field expecting it to survive. It needs to exercise natural behaviors. What other animals do we put in with it? Maybe we'd also have to resurrect some Pleistocene prey or use modern proxies like letting it prey on African buffalo or something, which is logistically crazy. Shipping African megafauna to wherever the Smilodon is. It starts to sound like building a mini Jurassic Park, doesn't it? A cool exhibit for sure, but is it a real wild existence for the animal? Not really. It would essentially be a Pleistocene theme park enclosure. There's also evidence that Smilodon may have been social, or at least lived in groups, a bit like lions do. Many Smilodon fossils were found together in the tar pits, suggesting maybe packs or prides of them were around. Or they all died trying to scavenge the same carcass and got stuck. That's also possible. If they were social, then bringing back just one would be like having a single lone wolf or one lion without a pride. Not ideal for the animal's mental health, but bringing back a whole group of saber-tooths multiplies all the challenges by 10. That's nowhere near feasible at the moment. So environmentally and socially, a resurrected Smilodon would struggle in the modern world. The climate is warmer, though Smilodon did live in some warm areas, so that part might be okay. But more importantly, the ecosystem it knew is gone. It would be a fish out of water, or rather, a prehistoric predator out of its time. We'd be forcing it into a world where it doesn't really belong, and it could suffer or cause others to suffer as a result. So, with all that said, you can see why the Smilodon isn't on the de-extinction roster, even while mammoths, thylacines, and dodos are. The DNA is too scarce and degraded. The genetic gap is too wide. There's no obvious surrogate species to carry a baby Smilodon. The engineering required is sci-fi level. And even if you surmounted all that, the poor cat would enter a world where it has no niche, and we'd have to question the ethics of bringing it into that situation. The woolly rhinoceros wasn't exactly pretty, but it was perfectly adapted to its harsh Ice Age home. Its official scientific name is Coelodonta antiquitatis, but that's a mouthful, so let's stick with woolly rhino. These beasts were roughly the size of a modern white rhinoceros, weighing a couple of tons, with two massive horns made of keratin on their snout. The front horn could be up to 3 to 4 feet long, like a prehistoric spiral missile, and the second horn sat closer to its forehead. It had a humped shoulder and a thick brush of long woolly fur, reddish-brown undercoat, with coarse guard hair on top, making it look super fluffy and tough against the cold. These woolly rhinos first appeared around 300,000 years ago and thrived through the Pleistocene epoch. They were roaming across what is now Europe, Siberia, and Central Asia, grazing on the grasses, ferns, and shrubs that grew in the Ice Age tundra and steppe. The rhinoceros's big horn wasn't just for looks. Scientists think it used that horn and its reinforced nasal bones like a snowplow or a digging tool. It would push aside snow or mud to reach the plants underneath. Pretty handy trick if you've got snow up your belly. Adult woolly rhinos, being the heavyweights they are, had few predators. Maybe the occasional wolf or saber-tooth might pick off a weak or young one, but mostly they were at the top of their frozen world, munching away without many worries. Despite being so well adapted, the woolly rhino couldn't survive when the climate started warming around 10,000 years ago. Forests began replacing open grasslands, and humans armed with spears were hunting more frequently. Between losing their habitats and increased human pressure, their numbers steadily declined until they disappeared completely. Now, here's where people get confused. We hear about folks trying to de-extinct mammoths by using frozen DNA and elephant surrogates, but we rarely hear about doing the same with woolly rhinos. So why are scientists so quiet on the woolly rhino front? Is it just a conspiracy or laziness? Not really. It boils down to a bunch of practical problems, starting with the DNA. To bring back an extinct animal, scientists need a full, high-quality copy of its DNA. That's been somewhat possible with mammoths, thanks to frozen carcasses found in Siberian permafrost that preserved tissue and cells pretty well. But with a woolly rhino, it's been a lot harder. Until recently, we didn't even have a full genome. Some of the best DNA samples we've got came from cave hyena dung, leftovers from when hyenas ate rhino meat and passed fragments of it. As interesting as that is, it's far from ideal. Those fragments are too damaged and incomplete to build a full working genome, let alone clone an animal. And we don't have preserved rhino cells sitting in labs anywhere, which means we're missing the raw material needed to even start the cloning process. Even that new mummified rhino find in Siberia, the one in the news, with skin and tissue, is cool. But it's not like finding a sleeping woolly rhino in a cryochamber. Even if scientists solved the DNA puzzle, they'd still have another huge problem. Who could carry a baby woolly rhino? Mammoths had a big sister, the Asian elephant, almost like an older sibling in DNA terms, so the idea was to use elephants as surrogate mothers. For woolly rhinos, the closest thing we have is the Sumatran rhinoceros. But let me tell you, we're not going to ask a Sumatran rhino to suddenly start carrying an ancient rhino embryo. Why? First, there are only a couple of dozen Sumatran rhinos left in the world. They're critically endangered, hanging on by a thread in Asian forests. That species is struggling as it is. Using one as a lab for de-extinction? That would be like kidnapping one of the last pandas to try a risky cloning experiment. Just not going to happen. What about other rhinos? The African white rhinoceros is big and common. Well, common is still a stretch, but relatively. But genetically, it's not as close to the woolly rhino as the Sumatran is. And it's adapted to African savannas, not Arctic plains. And you can bet a baby woolly rhino being born in an African zoo would be very confused. Hey, why am I not freezing and where's the permafrost? Plus, rhinos have a long pregnancy, around 15 to 16 months, and they only have one calf at a time, a few years apart. That means even if you had a pipeline of woolly rhino embryos, producing a whole herd would take generations of rhinos and decades of patience. You get one embryonic rhino, stick it in a mother, wait 15 months for it to be born. Then 3 years later, the baby is ready for a mate, if it's female. This is not like breeding rabbits or chickens. It's slow, slow work. Contrast that with the enthusiasm around mammoths, where people imagine lots of elephant-like moms birthing hairy babies quickly. And you can see a big difference. Rhinos are just not speedy reproducers. Now, let's be honest. Sometimes science is just about popularity. Mammoths are getting all the headlines and money, but the woolly rhino is struggling to attract any attention at all. As weird as it sounds, part of the reason woolly rhinos are low on the resurrect list is simply public interest and media hype. The woolly mammoth has charisma. Think about it. Woolly mammoths show up in cartoons, kids' books, and that movie Ice Age. Remember the mammoth character Manny? The woolly rhino, on the other hand, is like the background mammal nobody made a cuddly toy out of. Okay, maybe somebody did, but not nearly as many. People aren't clamoring to see a hairy rhino plushie. Because of that, fundraising and research interest skews heavily toward mammoths. When donors want to throw money at de-extinction, they think mammoth or dodo or tiger, not woolly rhino. That lack of buzz means research advances come more slowly. It's only recently that anyone even tried to sequence rhino DNA in earnest. Some team sequenced the first woolly mammoth genome years ago. Even big biotech companies interested in de-extinction, like Colossal Biosciences, focus on species that catch headlines. Mammoths are sexy. Woolly rhinos are kind of an afterthought. Say we solved the DNA and surrogate puzzles. I know, dream on. What's the point of bringing back a woolly rhino today? Its habitat is gone. The icy grasslands it loved have changed. The Siberian tundra is warming. Forests are moving in. If a woolly rhino popped out now, where would it eat? The world it was adapted to doesn't exist except in small pockets. We have places like Pleistocene Park in Siberia where scientists are reintroducing horses, bison, and musk oxen to mimic ancient ecosystems. They even fantasize about mammoths using elephants and maybe rhinos, but that's a very controlled, cold environment. In the real world, releasing a cold-adapted rhino could be like putting a polar bear on the equator. The climate would be all wrong. Also, consider the numbers needed for a variable population. 1 or 2 cloned rhinos would be cool scientifically, but for a healthy population, you'd need many to avoid inbreeding. That's decades of effort in an unknown environment. It's not like rerouting a cruise ship on the Sea of Time. You'd be starting a whole new population for the first time in 10,000 years. Now, this might sound practical, but some say even if we could, should we? Woolly rhinos disappeared partly because humans hunted them. Ironically, some argue that we must restore what we drove extinct. Others worry about unforeseen consequences. Introducing a large prehistoric herbivore could disrupt modern ecosystems. It's a bit like Jurassic Park minus dinosaurs, but close. Would a revived woolly rhino have a decent life, or would we be dooming it to wander zoo-like enclosures? Scientists ask, is our limited science better spent saving creatures that need help now? There are already 5 living rhino species: white, black, Indian, Javan, and Sumatran, most of which are endangered due to poaching. Some people feel we should pour our resources into those rather than resurrect one that walked the earth before recorded history. Let's not forget the basics. Science is like a good challenge, but it also needs a purpose. Cloning a mammoth or a rhino isn't just make sci-fi real. It can help with technology, like gene editing, and maybe even rescue elephants from diseases. But if we shift focus to a woolly rhino, the payoffs aren't obvious. The woolly rhino doesn't solve climate change by raising seed banks. It wouldn't help save any living relatives' genes in the same way. It's an interesting puzzle, yes, but one with diminishing returns once you realize how many loose ends there are. So, in a nutshell, scientists aren't refusing to bring back the woolly rhino because they hate rhinos. They're not ignoring it for secret reasons. It's simply a nightmare project. We have barely enough DNA, no good surrogate mother, a world that's not ready for it, and countless obstacles every step of the way. Meanwhile, there are more pressing uses of science and money, from conserving the rhinos we have today to dealing with climate and biodiversity loss. That's why the woolly rhino remains a fascinating fossil and a question mark of the past rather than a living symbol of the future. We love to imagine ancient creatures with our modern tech, but not every extinct animal is up for resurrection. Mammoths might be dreamt of because they have a close living twin and a tempting mythos. Woolly rhinos, being the less famous cousin, don't get that pass. That's all for today. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share it with your friends. You can also leave a comment with what you would like to see in the following videos. Thanks for watching. See you next time.